Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel, where we tell the scariest and most supernatural stories you've ever heard. Today, we bring you true stories of mysterious trails, forgotten paths where the inexplicable and the terrifying seem to hide. Sometimes, the most remote trails hold dark secrets, and those who venture down them may not return the same way. Get ready to hear breathtaking experiences, lived by ordinary people who were surprised by something far beyond what they expected. So, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and come with us to explore the mysteries of forgotten trails. And remember, not all trails are just paths in the forest, some lead straight to the unknown. The Forgotten Trail. It was an autumn afternoon, and I was determined to explore a remote trail in a forest near a small town in the mountains of Oregon. The trail name wasn't on any of the tourist maps, but a local mentioned that there was an old trail, used by loggers decades ago, now largely forgotten. This only heightened my curiosity. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon. The place looked abandoned, with vegetation growing everywhere, nearly obscuring what was left of the trail. The trees formed a dense canopy, and the air was humid and stagnant. Something made me hesitate, but I ignored it, thinking it was just the excitement of exploring something so isolated. I walked for about an hour, without seeing a single soul. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves beneath my feet. Then I noticed a sudden silence. It was as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. There was no wind, not even the sound of small animals. Just absolute silence. It was then that I began to hear footsteps behind me. It sounded like someone walking through the vegetation, but when I looked back, I saw no one. I tried to ignore it, thinking that it might be my mind playing tricks, but the footsteps continued, always at a constant distance. The trail became narrower, and the trees denser. The further I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. After a few minutes, I heard a muffled laugh, almost like a whisper. I stopped immediately. This was definitely not normal. I looked around again, but there was no one. Only silence, which now seemed heavier, almost oppressive. I kept walking, my heart racing now. The footsteps and laughter continued intermittently, always at the same distance. I tried to pick up the pace, but the faster I went, the more it seemed like something was following me closely. The trail began to climb, and the vegetation became denser and denser, as if the forest was trying to swallow me. Finally, I saw a small clearing ahead and, with desperate relief, I ran towards it. When I arrived, silence returned. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the clearing was empty. It was then that I noticed something strange. In the center of the clearing, there was a small wooden cabin, covered in moss and almost falling apart. It wasn't on any of the maps, and I had never heard of a cabin there. I approached slowly, with a bad feeling. As I got closer to the door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something inside me told me not to go in, but curiosity won out. The door was ajar, and with a gentle push, it swung open completely. The inside of the cabin was dark, but I could make out a few shapes, an old table, some broken chairs, and what looked like an unlit fireplace. But what caught my attention most was a notebook on the table, covered in dust. I picked it up carefully and blew the dust away to read the first few pages. They were the notes of someone who had apparently been trapped in those woods. The last entry, however, made my blood run cold. I am not alone. Something is watching me. I feel like I am being hunted. I heard your laughter again today. I need to get out of here, before it is too late. I quickly closed the notebook, feeling a wave of dread. I left the cabin as fast as I could and started back down the trail. The footsteps and laughter did not stop until I was back where I had started, panting and sweating. When I told this story to the local who had told me about the trail, he turned pale. He said that no one had talked about that trail for years, and that many who had ventured there had come back different, if at all. I had never set foot in that forest again since. The presence on the canyon trail. I've always loved hiking, and one of my favorite routes was in a national park in Washington state. It was a long and challenging trail, but the view of the canyon valley at the end was always worth the effort. That day, the weather was perfect, clear skies, mild temperatures, and almost no one in the park, just the way I liked it. The trail started out easy, but after a few miles, the steep climbs and sharp switchbacks took a toll. About halfway up, I noticed something was out of the ordinary. A crow flew right by me, perching on a low branch of a tree. It watched me intently, and soon after, more crows joined in, all staring at me. I thought it was odd, but I kept walking. As time went on, the surroundings began to change. The trees around me seemed denser and more twisted, and the air grew heavier. I was no longer hearing the typical sounds of nature, like birdsong or the wind in the trees. Instead, everything was quiet, oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my stubbornness kept me going. Further ahead, the trail passed through a rocky area, and that's when things started to get really unsettling. I was climbing a narrow path between the rocks when I heard a voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that it was coming from somewhere nearby. I stopped and looked around, but there was no one. The park was practically empty that day. I kept walking, but now I was on high alert. With each step, the sound of the whisper seemed to get closer, as if someone were following me closely. I looked back several times, but there was no one. Fear began to set in. Still, I kept going, determined to finish the trail. When I reached a high point on the trail where I could see the valley, I felt a temporary relief. The place was beautiful, with a breathtaking view. But that relief was short-lived. Just as I was about to start my descent, I heard footsteps behind me, coming from the rocks I had passed. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone. But again, there was no one. The silence around me was unbearable, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My heart raced, and it was at that moment that I realized I was not alone. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. It was as if something was watching me, studying me. Suddenly, a strong smell of damp earth and mold filled the air, and I began to feel dizzy. The whispering came again, louder this time, almost right next to me. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was about to happen. But with every step I took, the presence seemed to get closer. And then, out of nowhere, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned around in a desperate reflex, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, and my entire body was shaking. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear: I needed to get out of there, and fast. I started down the trail as fast as I could, almost tripping over the rocks. The whispering didn't stop, and the presence kept following me, getting closer and closer. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I made it back to the trailhead. The park was still empty, and the feeling of being followed disappeared as soon as I stepped into the parking lot. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I never found out what really happened on that trail. I returned to the park a few times, but I never had the courage to go down that path again. Some people say that trails like these hold ancient secrets, and that those who don't respect their surroundings may end up finding something they weren't prepared to see. The Echo on the Lost Trail. The area around Boulder, Colorado, is known for its beautiful mountain trails. Most of them are well marked and maintained, but there are some that locals avoid, old, nearly abandoned routes that few people dare to follow. I heard about one such trail from a friend who mentioned, somewhat casually, that it had been closed for years due to a landslide. The idea of exploring something forgotten appealed to me immediately. One Friday morning, I decided to give it a try. I set off early and headed toward the mountains. The trailhead was overgrown with vegetation, with no signage or any indication that there was a path there. It was almost as if nature itself had tried to erase its existence. But with a little effort, I found what seemed to be the beginning of the trail. At first, the trail was easy, although visibly poorly maintained. There were fallen trees blocking part of the path, and the ground was uneven, but the environment was serene. The only thing that bothered me was a constant echo. With each step I took, the sound seemed to reverberate back to me, as if the mountains were reflecting everything with an unusual intensity. It was a strange sensation, but I attributed it to the shape of the terrain. About an hour later, the trail began to narrow, and the vegetation around me seemed denser and more suffocating. It was then that I began to notice something peculiar. With each step I took, the echo seemed to be delayed, almost as if there was another person walking behind me, imitating my movements with a slight delay. I stopped several times to listen, but the silence was absolute as soon as I stopped walking. I decided to continue, but the feeling of being followed began to intensify. I constantly turned to look back, but I never saw anything, just the empty trail and the trees in the distance. The sound of my footsteps and the delayed echo made me increasingly nervous. Further ahead, the trail split into two paths, and for some inexplicable reason, I felt a strong attraction to the path on the left, the darker and less used one. I decided to follow him, despite a bad feeling. The air there seemed colder, and the silence was almost deafening. It was then that I heard for the first time something that was not the echo of my footsteps. A faint murmur, almost indistinguishable, but definitely human. It sounded like a voice whispering something. I stopped immediately, my heart pounding, and listened carefully. The murmur continued, but I could not make out the words. I looked around, but there was no one. Now, fully alert, I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing feeling of fear. The murmur seemed to follow me, as if something were talking to me, but not revealing itself. The echo of my footsteps continued to lag behind, as if someone were imitating me right behind. Finally, I came to a small, dimly lit clearing. In the center was a large, jagged rock covered in moss. The murmur stopped as soon as I entered the clearing, but the air was heavy, and the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. I decided to rest for a while and approached the rock. It was then that I saw something that made me freeze in fear. On the ground around the rock were footprints. Fresh footprints, exactly like mine, but going in the opposite direction. It was as if someone had been walking behind me the whole time, following my footsteps. Dread took hold of me, and I knew I had to get out of there immediately. I turned to go back along the trail, but as soon as I took the first step, I heard the delayed echo again, this time much closer. Now I knew I was not alone. I started running, my heart pounding, and with each step I took, the echo of the footsteps became louder, closer. The murmur returned, this time louder, almost as if it were right next to me. I ran as fast as I could back along the trail, without looking back. The feeling that something was about to catch up with me was terrifying. When I finally saw the beginning of the trail, the presence disappeared. The echo stopped, the murmur ceased, and silence returned. I have never been able to explain what happened that day. Some say that certain places hold ancient energies, and that trails like that one, which have been abandoned, can harbor echoes of those who passed through there before. I have never explored unknown trails again since then. The whisper on the mountain trail. I have always loved hiking, especially in the mountains of Colorado. There was one trail in particular, called the Lonely Mountain Trail, that I had wanted to explore for years. No one seemed to know much about it, and the information available was scarce. All I knew was that it was a long, difficult route with spectacular views at the end. One summer morning, I finally decided to tackle this trail. The weather was perfect, and I was excited for the adventure. I started early to make the most of the day, and the trail was as secluded as I had hoped. At first, the path was quiet and the environment was exactly what I was looking for, nature at its purest and most untouched. As I continued, the trail became steeper and the terrain more rocky. The trees became sparser, and the views of the valley below were breathtaking. That was when I began to notice something peculiar. The absolute silence that enveloped the area was unsettling. There was no typical sound of animals or wind. Just a heavy silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds. Around noon, I came to a more open area with some large, flat rocks that looked like a great place to rest and enjoy the view. I sat down and started eating a snack, but soon realized that the silence was becoming increasingly oppressive. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the environment was making a conscious effort to keep out any noise. It was then that I heard a whisper. It was a barely audible sound, like someone was speaking softly, but too close for me to ignore. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. The whispering continued, and I realized that it seemed to be coming from the rocks around me. The sound was inconsistent, now coming from one side, now another. I decided to get up and investigate, following the sound. The rocks were large and full of crevices, and the closer I got, the louder the whispering became, but I could never make out what was being said. The feeling of being watched began to grow, and I couldn't ignore the idea that something was there, hidden among the rocks. The feeling of unease was growing, and I decided to head back up the trail. Just as I began to descend, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence returned, but now it felt even more unsettling. Every step I took seemed to echo off the rocks, and I couldn't help but think that I was being followed. The descent was one of the most agonizing moments of my life. I felt as if something was following me, always at a safe distance, but always there. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and every sound seemed amplified by my growing paranoia. When I finally reached the trailhead, the relief was immense. However, the uneasiness didn't go away. Local accounts I found later suggest that this trail has a history of mysterious disappearances and unexplained sightings. Some believe that the place holds something dark, something that should not be disturbed. I never returned to the lonely mountain trail. Sometimes trails can hold more than just beautiful views, they can hide secrets that are best left untouched. I hope you enjoyed these spooky and intriguing accounts of forgotten trails. If these stories have left you as uneasy as they have me, leave a comment below and share your own experience or theory about what might be happening in these mysterious places. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future explorations into the unknown. Turn on the bell to receive notifications and stay up to date with the next videos full of mystery and terror. Thanks for watching, and until next time, where we will continue to explore the supernatural and the unexplained. Remember, what you don't see may be what scares you the most. See you then.